going on in Australia at the moment? Is this just going to be how it is? And where do you draw the line? Because if there's no vaccine, does this have to go on for months and years?
Look, I think as far as the health advice goes at the moment, Pete, absolutely. I think if we're going to see further secondary outbreaks across the country, there's going to have to be this localised containment. Unless we have a more radical form of social distancing and potentially face mask wearing, I think there's a bit of a balance to be struck here, ultimately with the economic recovery, because government's ultimately going to need to make a call in the coming months if we're going to see this go on and on and on about the broader impacts. So, yeah, well, I mean, look, and we know that a COVID vaccine's probably at least 12 months away. You know, it's just going to keep on going otherwise, mate.
And you can't even be sure that it's going to be another 12 months away. Now, Daniel Andrews is taking a serious heat for this, and the New South Wales government did take a lot of heat too for the Ruby Princess fiasco. What's your view of what was at fault here? You know, was it the Premier's position on security guards who were quarantining hotels? Or was it the marches, Black Lives Matter marches? Or was it the easing of restrictions when the mindset of everyone kind of changed? What do you put it down to?
Look, it was probably a bit of everything there, Pete. Like, I mean, the Premier had a really strong stand on the Black Lives Matter protest. He was opposed to it from the start. He said that shouldn't happen. And it was obviously, he made the point, I think, yesterday that, of course, Victorian police weren't going to arrest 10,000 protesters. I actually sense, particularly from a Sydney-based perspective, Pete, a bit of a change in the community attitudes once the Prime Minister came out and announced those sort of stage 3 easings. And that wasn't really, I'm not saying that was the fault of the Prime Minister at all. I just think that people are limited bandwidth when it comes to receiving these government messages. We've been used to lockdown and moving in a certain direction, and I think that really signalled us being able to start to return to normal. And I think that people then, you know, very quickly started to drop some of the discipline around social distancing, for example.
Well, particularly young people, I found, because they don't consume the news the way that we do.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. And you know, and we can't expect people to be sort of, you know, in watching Sky all the time. Obviously, we love them to, but they can't. Yeah. So getting the regular updates is difficult. And so when people see that, you know, restrictions are going, business is back to normal, you understand that some of those messaging, and we are, you know, we're a sort of very lackadaisical, lucky as she goes type of country, that once we're back to normal, it's back to normal. And the reality is, as we've said previously, until we get that vaccine, there is no back to normal. So we do need to sort of exercise that discipline. So there's going to have to be a bit of careful thinking as we see these secondary outbreaks, and being really careful about how we go and do these lockdowns too.
Well, Greg Sheridan on The Australian today argues that democracy is failing in Victoria. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I couldn't disagree more strongly there, Pete. I think it's a bit of a worry when the foreign policy editor at The Australian, who's obviously covering authoritarian regimes across the world, makes that comment about Victoria. We've got a very robust democracy in place, Parliament meeting, parliamentary scrutiny, a judicial review of the quarantine procedures, completely appropriate, just like we saw with what happened with the Ruby Princess in New South Wales. And really importantly, in Victoria, you know, you've got rigorous daily scrutiny of the Premier and key ministers. Tuning into those, like, they're often hour-long press conferences that Dan Andrews gives, and there's no shirking or there's no hiding, and he's the first to say he accepts responsibility, and I suppose ultimately he's accountable and the government's accountable at the ballot box too.
Yeah, well, but there are questions to answer there, to be fair, in the same way that there are questions to be answered for Ruby Princess, and, you know, no one has lost their jobs in that senior level of government over the Ruby Princess debacle. But that fire's since been put out, and now you've got this new one that's emerged. But, I mean, the cynics will argue that the reason the Premier keeps referring to this judicial review is so that he doesn't have to take questions on it. So that's Greg Sheridan's point, is because, you know, he's not answering to it, deflecting, so that's his argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of a funny point to say that somehow launching a judicial inquiry is about avoiding scrutiny. I mean, I think there's every chance that the judicial inquiry we have in New South Wales and the one in Victoria in relation to the national quarantine arrangements will have some very awkward recommendations and findings when it comes to both governments and the actions of both governments. And so I don't think that's really avoiding scrutiny at all. And then I suppose that does give the evidence base, both for the Premier here and for the Premier in Victoria, to take further actions if they need to with ministerial colleagues or with, you know, senior bureaucrats as well. And there's a broader point there about the national quarantine arrangements, Pete. This was put in place by by the National Cabinet, maybe there needed to be more guidance for the states about how to exactly implement it. Well, are we going to use ADF? Are we going to use police, law enforcement, or are we going to use security guards? How are the health procedures supposed to work?
Well, National Cabinet's on tomorrow, so the timing is pretty good there. I'm sure that will be discussed. Just finally, JobKeeper extension, the Treasurer has already pointed this. It seems a foregone conclusion that it will be happening, particularly for those sectors that have been hit hardest. And now we're seeing that tax cuts may well be brought forward too.
Yeah, that's right, Pete. At the moment, we've got tax cuts legislated for 2022 involving both the 19% and 32.5% brackets. So bringing that forward by 12 months, which is the speculation, would be a useful boost. And I suppose in some ways that's more about smoothing the economic recovery in 12 months' time. Clearly, there's going to be actions in place, and I think the Prime Minister and Treasurer were very clear about this yesterday. There's going to be some extensions of JobKeeper and probably JobSeeker 2 in September. We knew we needed it anyway. We knew particular sectors were doing really, really tough. We now know with Victoria, the writing's on the wall, the economic recovery is going to be stalled, so we're going to need that government support for longer into the future.